The READ Act, a policy journey through literacy and equity. Early literacy has been widely studied, yet identifying the most effective approach has gone through many ups and downs. In response to the continued need for students to become skilled readers, Minnesota passed the READ Act in 2023. No Child Left Behind focuses on reading in kindergarten through third grade. The policy emphasized accountability, standardized testing, and funding for evidence-based reading instruction, with a focus on the 5 pillars of reading. Over time, national data continued to show a decrease in reading proficiency, particularly in students from historically marginalized communities. At the same time, the science of reading movement was gaining momentum, supported by decades of empirical research in cognitive science and literacy development. Scholars like Hollis Scarborough and Keith Stanovich engaged in research that demonstrated that reading is a complex, learned process, one that requires explicit, systematic instruction. Then, in 2015, No Child Left Behind was replaced by the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. ESSA provided states with the flexibility to address the increasing number of students not achieving reading proficiency. ESSA changed how states responded and implemented policies and approaches to improve literacy outcomes by shifting from federal control to local control. Response to Intervention, or RTI, and the Multi-Tiered System of Support, or MTSS framework, were nationally recognized and accepted as an essential response to the persisting need to interrupt and reverse the trend of declining reading proficiency. Together with the science of reading, pressure to enact policy change at the state level led directly towards the Minnesota READ Act. This all led to the steady climb towards change. This law requires schools to align literacy instruction with evidence-based practices grounded in the science of reading. It mandates universal screening in kindergarten through third grade, ongoing progress monitoring, and targeted intervention for students not yet reading at grade level. It also requires school districts statewide to provide approved professional development for educators. Implementation is in phases, beginning with primary reading teachers, ML teachers, and special ed teachers, ensuring that teachers are trained in structured literacy practices that are based in the science of reading. This is policy in motion, moving from intention to implementation. At its core, the READ Act is driven by a commitment to equity. The goal is clear: to ensure that every student, regardless of background, has access to the instruction they need to become a skilled reader. But equity in policy is complex. Universal screening identifies students who need support, yet research shows that identification is biased. Screeners can over-identify students who are multilingual learners, students receiving special education services, and students from historically underserved communities as at risk for reading deficiencies. The READ Act policy affects students, families, teachers, and district leaders differently. Using a universal screener, students are identified earlier for literacy intervention. Families receive earlier communication about their child's reading progress. Teachers are asked to make data-driven instructional moves to support striving readers. District leaders must allocate financial resources to meet the new requirements of the READ Act. The intention is equitable access, but outcomes will depend on how school districts implement the READ Act. Implementing the READ Act requires an investment. Districts must purchase approved curriculum, invest in screening tools, and provide professional development. In the short term, this creates financial pressure, requiring time, staffing, and sustained funding. But in the long term, the economic and social argument is clear. Early literacy is linked to graduation rates, workforce readiness, economic stability, and overall well-being. Investing in early literacy is an investment in the future. And this is where the ride keeps moving, where policy meets practice. Across Minnesota, educators are being trained in the science of reading. This statewide training includes 40-plus hours of training. Phase 1 focuses on elementary classroom teachers, ML teachers, and special ed teachers, while Phase 2 will expand to include secondary English and reading teachers, as well as paraprofessionals. Using state-approved resources for the training, OLA, Letters, or CARE, educators are learning new instructional methods, reflecting on long-held practices, and adjusting to new instructional expectations for literacy instruction. For many, this feels both promising and overwhelming. Teachers are balancing professional learning, classroom instruction, and the pressure to meet each student's needs immediately. Implementation is not just about meeting the requirements of the READ Act, it's about staying centered on students and addressing the current decline in reading proficiency nationwide. The next phase is already beginning. With secondary educators now being included in literacy training and expectations, how would this shift impact middle and high school instruction? How will systems adapt to support older students who are not part of the early literacy supports defined in the READ Act? The READ Act began as a response to declining reading proficiency nationwide, but its impact extends beyond the early grades. And as the journey continues, we begin to think about what lays ahead for early literacy instruction and the possibilities this policy can mean for students if it truly leads to students reading at grade level proficiency.